Welcome everyone. King's Politics is likely to be joined by Noam Chomsky. He is hailed as the father of modern linguistics and one of the founders of cognitive science. He is currently Laureate Professor of Linguistics at the University of Arizona and Professor Emeritus at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He has authored more than 150 books, ranging from Manufactured Consent to Who Rules the World and on Palestine. This interview will center around the topic of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, which ended a 20-year struggle in the nation, as well as Western intervention in the Middle East more broadly, both its historical context and future developments. In terms of format, we'll aim for roughly 30 minutes of questions, with the remainder of the session allowing for audience questions, which you can submit through the chat function. As a first question, I just wanted to ask, what were your initial reactions to the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, and in what ways were the ramifications foreseeable?
Could you say it again? I didn't quite get it.
What were your initial reactions to the US withdrawal from Afghanistan?
The US invasion of Afghanistan?
Withdrawal.
In the first, or the withdrawal?
Yeah.
The withdrawal.
Yeah.
Well, the withdrawal had been arranged by President Trump in February 2020, completely ignoring the Afghans, totally selling them out. He made an arrangement with the Taliban that the US would withdraw in May 2021, the worst possible time, right at the beginning of the fighting season. And the withdrawal would be unconditional. The Taliban could do whatever they like. The one condition was that they not fire on American troops. That was it. Biden came in and pretty much accepted the Trump arrangement. He delayed the withdrawal, which is somewhat of an improvement, gave a little time for accommodation, added a few conditions, but pretty much the same arrangements. It was quite obvious at the time. I don't say this in retrospect. You can look back to what I was writing. It was quite obvious at the time that the Afghan government, which is a morass of corruption, would very quickly collapse. And a lot of the Afghan army would follow pretty quickly. A lot of the army was ghost soldiers, not even there, just put on the list to allow corrupt commanders to gain money from it. Other soldiers weren't paid, they didn't have arms. There were units that were organized, but it was pretty clear that as soon as it was clear how the tide was turning, the army would evaporate. Why should they fight for a foreign power? What was surprising, to me at least, was the way the Taliban were able to broaden their level of support to the non-Pushtun minorities. Uzbek, Tajik warlords quickly joined the Taliban. That had not happened before, and they pretty quickly took over the territory of what had been the Northern Alliance. So that was, I think, a surprise, but the rest was just predictable, and the Afghan people were simply not consulted. It's not their business. Meanwhile, it's not actually a withdrawal. Bombing, drone attacks, that continues, probably special forces, but it was a substantial withdrawal, which predictably led to the collapse of the government. Most of the army very quickly spread to other minority groups, and the situation we're now in is that there's a very severe humanitarian crisis, and there are two alternatives in the international system as to how to address the problem. One, which is based on China the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that's the Central Asian states, Russia, Pakistan, Iran, India, basically the regional system, China-based. Their position is that they should deal with the Taliban, try to induce them to moderate their positions, to become more inclusive, try maybe to shift their economy slowly from opium production for Europe mostly to exploitation of their mineral resources, and crucially to deal directly with the humanitarian crisis by aid and other kinds of support. That's one approach. The other approach, which is sponsored by the United States, Europe more or less going along, India agrees with it. It's the only one of the neighboring countries. That is to punish the population by sanctions, by holding funds of the government funds happen to be in New York banks. So hold on to the funds, don't return them to the government. Meanwhile, the international financial institutions, presumably under US pressure, are withholding loans and aid while the humanitarian crisis expands. That's pretty much where we stand now.
I want to ask, what does the US withdrawal from Afghanistan signify for US power in the world?
Essentially nothing. The US invasion, most aggression and invasions are for strategic reasons. So the invasion of Iraq was criminal, worst crime of the century, but at least it had a justification. Iraq has enormous oil resources, very easy to tap. They don't do any deep sea drilling. It's right in the center of the world's major energy production. The US goals in invading Iraq were explicit and stated: take over Iraq and then expand US power to other states in the region. That's standard imperial aggression. Putting aside any judgment about it, it has strategic significance. The invasion of Afghanistan had nothing. There was no strategic significance to invading Afghanistan. It was a pointless act of violence in fact, the only serious explanation I've seen for it is right after the invasion, mid-October 2001, there was an interview by Anatol Yevin, a distinguished Central Asian scholar. He interviewed Abdul Haq, the leading figure in the anti-Taliban Afghan resistance, highly regarded figure. Abdul Haq, who was in The Guardian, you can find it if you want, about October 15th, 2001, approximately then. He asked Abdul Haq, why are the Americans invading? And his answer was, they don't care anything about the Afghans. They know they're going to kill lots of Afghans. They're going to undermine our efforts to overthrow the Taliban from within, which he regarded as rather promising. They're doing it because they want to show their muscle and intimidate everyone in the world. It's probably accurate. It was supported by the US reaction, which we're learning more about now than was known then. The Taliban agreed to surrender within about a month or so. They basically went back to their villages, can't fight the American war machine. So they offered to surrender, which would of course meant that Al-Qaeda, bin Laden would have been subject to extradition. The US reaction was we do not negotiate surrenders, period. That was stated explicitly by Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, echoed by President Bush, who went on to say at press conferences, we don't really know where Al-Qaeda is or bin Laden is, and we don't care much. It's not our interest. Our interest is bigger game. They were going on to Iraq and then beyond. So I think it was, and in fact, it's worth remembering that at the time, October 2001, the United States didn't really know that Al-Qaeda and bin Laden was responsible for 9/11. In fact, 8 months after that, the head of the FBI, Robert Mueller, gave his first major press conference, which is May 2002, long after the invasion. And he said, we suspect that Al-Qaeda is responsible, but we haven't been able to demonstrate it to prove it yet. That's 8 months after the invasion. Well, I think all of that supports Abdul Haq's judgment, the only serious suggestion I've seen as to why the US invaded. And from the US point of view, from the US imperial point of view, made very little sense. They had no interest in Afghanistan. They just got caught up in something, couldn't get out of it. Now that they're out, they can turn to further pursuits. I don't regard it as having much of an effect on US imperial global policy.
In the discourse surrounding Afghanistan, there's a conflict between those who argue we should have remained against those who argue that it was time to leave. Do you think it was a necessity for US troops to leave Afghanistan at the time they did?
I think there were much better options. The US troops had to leave. They were simply causing more problems, especially in the rural areas, which is the overwhelming majority of the country. The procedures of the troops, the way they trained the Afghan army was simply alienating the population and creating more support for the Taliban. When you send troops into people's homes at midnight and humiliate everyone, take out a husband or a son and send them to a torture chamber, and meanwhile have a drone attack that kills people at a wedding party, you don't get support from the population. You increase recruitment for the Taliban. It's been going on for 20 years. There were improvements in Kabul, just as there were under the Russians. You look at the last years of the Russian invasion in Kabul, there was a lot of freedom. Women were free. They could wear the clothes they wanted. They could have jobs. The literacy sharply increased in Kabul, not in the countryside. Americans sort of duplicated that situation. So there was no way for them to stay, but there were much better ways to leave. It could have taken into consideration the people of Afghanistan for the first time. What do they want? They're not voiceless. There are Laureate Professors, there are elders, there was a peace movement, mostly young people. They could have been brought into the discussion, could have been arranged, the timing could have been arranged so that there could have been local accommodations, as in fact did begin to develop, which might have eased the situation. Meanwhile, humanitarian aid, was desperately needed and should have been provided. All of these options were possible. Would they have succeeded? We have no idea. Maybe not, but at least they could have been tried.
Does the rise of the Taliban pose a threat to international security?
Sorry.
Does the rise of the Taliban pose a threat to international security?
Are they a threat to international security?
Yeah.
No, they're not a threat to international security. They may be a threat to the people of Afghanistan, but actually, they're a threat to China. In the western provinces of China, the area of the Turkic tribes, there is plenty of resentment, a lot of it because of harsh Chinese repression. But there are also terrorist-based organizations which may implant themselves in Afghanistan. And that's one of the things China's concerned about. In fact, there is a mini war going on right now in Afghanistan between the Taliban and what's in fact kind of an offshoot of ISIS. But that's not a threat to the West, that's a threat to China. The last thing that the Taliban want is any form of terrorist activity that would bring in Western power again. They didn't want it in the first place. They would have very likely, if back in 2001, if the United States had been interested in capturing bin Laden and terminating Al-Qaeda, as I said, they obviously weren't interested. But if they had been, probably a small police operation would have sufficed, probably with cooperation from the Taliban, who, for reasons of the well-established tribal code, were not going to expel bin Laden. You don't do that. But they had no interest in having him stay there. In fact, they had made many offers of possible extradition, which the US rejected. So I think it's fairly safe to say that the potential terrorist threat in Afghanistan is probably to China.
I guess I want to touch upon sort of the overall historical context of intervention in the Middle East and areas of conflict. What drives US foreign policy to invade these nations despite the possible ramification of destroying societies and systems?
What drives US intervention in the Middle East?
Despite the possible ramifications of destroying systems and
throughout the Middle East region.
Yeah, despite the fact that despite the ramifications for the people living there.
I didn't hear the last few words.
Despite the impact for the people living there.
People of the world?
The people living in those regions.
Of the Middle East?
Yeah.
They're of no concern. Imperial powers do not act in the interests of the populations they're controlling. Britain has hundreds of years of experience in this. Did Britain care about the people of India? Is that why Britain deindustrialized India, destroyed it, robbed its higher technology in order for its own development, and carried out massive famines? It's not caring for the people of India. In the Middle East, before the Second World War, was mostly a British domain, secondarily France. And they were there mainly to control energy resources, also for geopolitical reasons. A highly strategic area because of its location, Suez Canal, and so on. The interests and needs of the population were approximately zero. And when the US took over after the Second World War, pretty much removing the British, the French were simply summarily expelled on the pretext that the Vichy government had been supporting the Nazis. So therefore, all the French concessions were simply dismissed. The US took them over. That was 1945, following years. Slowly, the US displaced Britain, and it followed pretty much the same policies. So British policies in the Middle East, by and large, had been to support radical Islam in opposition to secular nationalism. This is well documented and discussed in the work of a very fine British diplomatic historian, Mark Curtis. When the US took over, it adopted pretty much the same policies, and for the same reasons. For the imperial powers, secular nationalism is a much more dangerous threat than radical Islam. Radical Islam may harm the population, but it tends to be obedient. It doesn't struggle against the imperial powers. Its concerns are internal. Secular nationalism can lead to dismantling of the imperial system. Now, that was dramatically the case in 1967, which had a major influence on the Middle East. Before 1967, US relations with Israel were amicable, but not out of the range of normal international relations. In fact, sometimes quite hostile, as when Eisenhower expelled Israel along with Britain and France from the Sinai when they invaded the Sinai in violation of US orders. You're not allowed to do that. So he simply expelled all three of them, Britain, France, and Israel. 1967 changed all that. There was a war going on at the time between Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Saudi Arabia is the center of radical Islamism. Egypt at the time was the center of secular nationalism. Israel's war smashed secular nationalism, a great gift to Saudi Arabia and to the United States. And US relations with Israel radically changed at that point. Enormous military aid, economic aid, ideological support, US culture radically changed at the time, Britain too. All of a sudden, for the first time, the Holocaust became a huge issue. It wasn't before. When survivors of the Holocaust in camps in the late 40s, they were still in camps, living under horrible conditions. They could not come to the United States. The United States blocked them, wasn't interested in saving Holocaust survivors, forced them to go to then Palestine. Ernest Bevin, you may recall, bitterly condemned this. He said, if you're concerned with them, why don't you take them in yourself instead of sending them to our territory in Palestine and raising more problems for us? No interest. When Roll Hilberg, the great historian of the Holocaust, published his first book, still the major study on extermination of the Jews, it was either ignored or even condemned. Nobody wanted to hear that kind of thing. This is around 1960. After 1967, changed radically. There has to be a Holocaust museum in every city, Holocaust courses in schools, not because the Holocaust became important in order to save victims, but as part of the ideological background for justifying the support for Israeli actions as long as they conformed to US demands. And that's increased. So in 1970, during the month of Black September, Jordanian troops were attacking Palestinian concentrations in Jordan. It looked briefly as though Syria might intervene to support the Palestinians. The US didn't want that, but this was 1970. The US was totally bogged down in Southeast Asia. Country was aflame with protests and demonstrations. The invasion of Cambodia had just taken place. They couldn't move in Middle East. So they asked Israel to act. Israel mobilized its forces, prevented Syria from intervening. US aid to Israel quadrupled. And so it's continued. Can go through the record, but that was a major turning point. Since then, basically imperial policy is being pursued. In fact, it was yesterday. Yesterday, Benny Gantz, the Israeli defense minister, entered into a military aid alliance with Morocco, with the Moroccan dictatorship. This is part of the so-called Abraham Accords, which are an effort initiated by the Trump administration to bring together the most reactionary, harsh states of the Middle East, in fact, the whole world, and have them as part of a basically reactionary alliance run from Washington. So in the Western Hemisphere, its main constituent is Bolsonaro's Brazil, proto-fascist government, fits very well. In the East and Southeast Asia, it's Modi's India. Modi's a perfect candidate, crushing Indian secular democracy, instituting a Hindu ethnocracy, invading, harshly extending the repression in Kashmir, basically taking it over. This is perfect. So he's a core part of the alliance. In the Middle East, Egypt, which is under the harshest dictatorship of its history, is a natural ally, closely allied with Israel. The Abraham Accords brought in the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Bahrain under extensive Saudi pressure, Sudan under threats that they'd better conform or else. So that's basically the Middle East core of the reactionary alliance run from Washington. That was Trump's major geostrategic plan. He may not have even understood it, but the plan of his advisors, what they instituted. And the Abraham Accords were part of that. It was just strengthened again yesterday. That's rational imperial policy. You can like it, you can hate it, but at least you can understand it. Very rational policy, very much like what the British did in their day in the sun.
This will be a final question before I go to the audience. And just as a final question, do you feel optimistic about improvements in the situation in Afghanistan for the people? That's pretty much it.
Do I feel optimistic about the people in Afghanistan?
Yeah, for improvement in their situation.
It's hard to feel very optimistic. They right now are facing a very severe humanitarian crisis. There could be massive deaths from malnutrition, disease. The Taliban government, which is a very weak and disorganized government, is embattled. It's fighting the rise of the ISIS offshoots. The United States is withholding aid, in fact, sequestering the funds of the Afghan government in New York, which is where they were held. Very likely, can't prove it, pressuring the international financial institutions not to provide aid. As I said, the China-based system is attempting to do something in their own interests. Doubtless, China hopes to incorporate Afghanistan within the Central Asian system that it's creating, basically the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Presumably they want to incorporate within that, maybe some aid and development will come out of it. But right now the prospects do not look very optimistic. One thing is a benefit. The major fighting has stopped, at least people in the villages can have a modicum of peace and security without constant fighting, intrusions, army entering and, carrying out crimes, at least some relaxation. But the future does not look very promising.
So we're moving to audience questions. The first question is, are the Afghan people owed reparations from the US?
Sorry.
Are the Afghan people owed reparations?
Do they deserve reparations from the US?
Yeah.
All the victims of imperial aggression deserve reparations. They're not going to get it. There's a very interesting book that came out a year or two ago by an Indian scholar, diplomat, Shashi Tharoor, about the British in India. The book originated at a debate at Oxford Debating Society, and the question at the debate was, should England pay reparations to India? Tharoor took the positive side, which actually won the debate by acclaim. But his position was the reparations should be 1 rupee a year for the 200 years, 300 years of British occupation. In other words, not a financial reparation, which is impossible. You can't pay reparations for destroying what had been the richest country in the world when the British entered and turning it into a total disaster area while enriching Britain. No way of paying reparations for that. So do it symbolically. And in fact, I think it was Jeremy Corbyn who suggested that the proper form of reparations would be to teach the history honestly. Teach what actually happened to students at King's College. Let them know what the history was. That's the reparations. I think he had a good point. So yes, aid is needed because people desperately need it, but there's no way to provide reparations. Just as in the United States, you can't pay reparations to the indigenous population, most of which was exterminated by the English settlers, brutal, savage settlers who simply raced through the territory, exterminating and expelling people. Meanwhile, picking up half of Mexico in an aggressive war. Can't pay reparations for that. Can't pay reparations for the most hideous system of slavery in human history. You can try to deal with the legacy that was left, but reparations can at most be symbolic. And the best reparations are telling the truth about it, which is a battle. In England, after hundreds of years, there is just the bare beginnings in England of facing up to the actual history of what happened. Books like Thoreau's and a couple of others, Richard Gott, a couple other people, are beginning to lift the veil after hundreds of years of suppression. In the United States, there's a battle going on right now, a major battle. It's going to be a major point in the coming elections. The Republicans want desperately to suppress the whole history. Republican states are passing laws criminalizing the attempt in schools to use texts like the New York Times 1619 Project, which began to lift the veil on 400 years of vicious, murderous oppression of Afro-Americans. The election in Virginia, which you probably followed a couple of weeks ago, was won by the Republicans, mainly on the claim that these communist Democrats who want to destroy the white race are forcing little children innocent little white children to be tarred as brutal oppressors. All fabrication, of course, but works pretty well. You frighten parents that way. That's what we're seeing right now. Are we allowed to study and learn about the actual history of what happened? Republican Party, which fact of the matter is by now a proto-fascist party, say, no, we can't study it. We have to uphold the nobility of the white race and their magnificent achievements. Can't talk about what happened. Criminal. Pass laws to block it. I think by now about 30 states are involved. Well, that's the way the battle of reparations is fought. Try to talk about what happened to the Native American population. You have to look pretty hard to find it. Actually, there are exceptions. I happen to be in one. I'm living right now in Arizona. The university where I'm teaching is on the territory of Indian tribes, stolen from them. They still live in reservations nearby, and the university is trying to do something about it. So it does have special courses and provisions on Native American studies, bringing in Native American students. Almost every major event on campus talk, say, begins with an acknowledgement that we are on the territory of the Tohono O'odham people, which was stolen from them, and we recognize this crime and want to compensate for it. Okay, that's the kind of reparations that can be done. Barely beginning in England after hundreds of years, not even beginning at all in France after vicious atrocities being fought about in the United States, a major issue in current politics. Can we even go as far as recognizing the truth of what happened?
Another question reads, will China continue the tradition of imperial aggression? Will China continue the tradition of imperial aggression?
Yes. Further questions?
The next question reads, will China continue the trend of imperial aggression?
Will China continue
the trend of imperial aggression?
Imperial aggression. What imperial aggression did you have in mind?
American and British.
American aggression?
In the past, yeah.
Are you talking about Chinese aggression or American aggression?
Chinese aggression.
Chinese aggression where?
I guess within
what?
I guess within its surroundings and its interests.
Well, if you don't tell me what Chinese aggression you have in mind, I can't comment on it. In Xinjiang province, in Tibet, in Hong Kong. I mean, is that what you mean? Chinese aggression in Africa? But where?
I think generally across different regions.
In?
All of the question doesn't really specify. What would you say about the regions you mentioned?
The Uyghur, for example?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's serious repression in the Western provinces. Actually, for the record, I was writing about this 20 years ago. Yes, there is severe Chinese repression in the Western provinces, Xinjiang province. It happens to be part of China, so it's not aggression. It's internal repression in China, which should be criticized and condemned, but it's not aggression. It's not aggression any more than repression inside the United States, England, or France is aggression. Condemn it, but it's not aggression. Similarly, when you could say that Israel's actions in the occupied territories, especially in Gaza, maybe you can call them aggression. The territories are occupied. Actually, if you look at Gaza, the situation is worse, I think, than anything that's been credibly reported in Western China. And we contribute to it directly, United States, also Britain. So yes, but it's not an international, it's not a threat to China. It's not an international threat. It's a crime, but not an international threat. So China's guilty of plenty of internal crimes. But when you look at international threats, it's a little hard to find them. About the only thing you can point to is Chinese refusal to accept international law in the South China Sea. The United States is not in a very strong position to object to that, because the United States is the one maritime power which has not even ratified the law of the sea. We just don't accept it, period. So it's not a very strong base for condemning China's rejection of international rulings there. These are problems, serious problems. They should be dealt with by diplomacy and negotiations with the regional powers in the lead. And I think that can be done and is already beginning to happen with various kinds of accommodations. The wrong way to deal with it is the way that the United States is carrying out with its loyal vassal Britain, following along politely, namely sending naval armadas into the South China Sea to raise the level of provocation. United States and of course Britain following along ever since it became a vassal state, probably becoming more so after Brexit. That's the wrong way to deal with it. The wrong way to deal with the problem is the recent AUKUS agreement, Australia, United Kingdom, US, sending a fleet of nuclear submarines to Australia, not for any strategic reason, none. They won't even be operative for about 15 years. Their sole effect is to impel China to radically increase its militarization in response to what in fact is a severe threat to China. China is already surrounded on the east by nuclear bases, US bases, with nuclear weapons and missiles aimed at China. One US nuclear submarine, can destroy almost 200 cities anywhere in the world. China has nothing like that. The US utterly overwhelms not only China, but the rest of the world combined in destructive nuclear force. So there are severe threats to China. There are crimes by China. They're not threats to the West. What the US, in fact, there was an interesting article in the Australian press a couple of weeks ago. A former Prime Minister, Paul Keating, highly regarded international diplomat, had an article on the China threat, asking, what is the China threat? Why are we accepting these nuclear submarines to defend ourselves from the China threat, probably partially made in Britain? And he concluded finally, after running through the possibilities, that the China threat is China's existence. That's the China threat. The existence of a country that the United States cannot control, cannot intimidate. That's an unacceptable threat. Any mafia don can explain it to you. You do not accept what's called successful defiance. Successful defiance is a term from the US diplomatic record. Go back to the early 1960s, Kennedy administration, when the war against Cuba was initiated. major terrorist war under Kennedy, a blockade which lasts until today. The reasons were stated by the State Department. It's because of Castro's successful defiance of US policies going back 150 years. That meant to the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which announced the US intention to dominate the hemisphere. The US couldn't implement it then. Britain was much too strong, but it was recognized by the US chief strategists, people like John Quincy Adams, the intellectual author of Manifest Destiny, Secretary of State, later President. He explained to the cabinet that right now we can't carry this out. We can't conquer Cuba. Britain's too strong. But over the years, British power will decline, US power will increase, we'll be able to establish our dominion over the hemisphere, take over Cuba. It will fall in our hands like an apple falls from a tree by the laws of political gravitation. That's the founding fathers. Well, they were right. Now, 1959, Cuba declared its independence. And furthermore, it was successful in defying the United States. That cannot be. We have to destroy them. Terrorist war, blockade. Europe doesn't like it. The world doesn't like it. There's a unanimous vote against it, virtually at the United Nations, but everyone obeys it because you don't step on the feet of the Godfather. That's dangerous. So Europe obeys the US blockade because it's afraid, just as Europe accepts the US sanctions against Iran, though it opposes them because it's afraid, with justification. The US is a violent power, not only militarily, controls the international financial system. You defy the United States, you get thrown out of the international financial system. It's not a small thing. Europe could act differently, but it doesn't. Certainly the United States is not going to tolerate the existence of China, a major power, not a small island off the coast of the United States, but a major power which cannot be controlled and cannot be intimidated. It's not like Europe. It's not like England. Can't be intimidated. Well, I think Keating is correct. It's the existence of China that's the China threat. And China's extending this threat. So China is now setting up 1,000 vocational schools in Southeast Asia, Africa, various parts of South America. And these vocational schools, China is so evil that these vocational schools are training students in Chinese technology, which means that Chinese technology will expand in Southeast Asia, Africa, and so on. And the United States and England have no response to this except bombs and nuclear submarines. So how can we tolerate the existence of China? Well, not a nice country, a lot of rotten things happening there, but this is the threat. The threat is 1,000 vocational schools, which will spread Chinese technology, investment and development, the Belt and Roads Initiative, which is integrating Central Asia into a Chinese-dominated economic sphere. That's a threat, its existence. But let's be honest about it, just as we should begin to be honest about hundreds of years of history.
I believe Alan McFarlane wishes to add on to this question. So you should get a request to unmute. Can you speak loudly as well, please?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello, Noam. We've been in touch in the past about you coming and doing an interview in Cambridge, which I'm still hoping will happen. But greetings and a wonderful set of answers so far. That last question was mine, and it was expanded. Is the British Empire and the American Empire were based on an aggressive Christian fundamentalist attitude, which is confrontational in all aspects of its politics, law, religion, and so on. Soon, the greatest empire will be the Chinese Empire. Do you believe they will continue in the tradition that the British and the Americans have formed over the last 300 years?
It's a fair question. I mean, when we talk about China, we're talking about a country of 3,000 years of history, not an upstart like the barbarians in Northwest Europe. China was along with India, China and India were the major powers of the world into the 18th century, until the period of British imperialism, Dutch and British imperialism, French imperialism. India alone had about 25% of world GDP and beginning around 1700. China was an advanced country, not in guns, but in other respects. And the Chinese system for thousands of years had been basically fealty, acknowledge us as the centers of, as the center of enlightenment and power, and then do what you want. That was pretty much the Chinese system. Acknowledge us, defer to us, be subordinate to us, but we don't impose ourselves on you. The Chinese had the capacity in the 17th and 18th century to invade Africa. They had the fleets, they had the huge ships, could have done it, but they didn't do it. That's not the way Chinese imperialism worked. Pay tribute to us, bow at the feet of the emperor, but that's our imperialism. Maybe they'll continue that. So I don't know. I mean, but so far at least, the Chinese have expanded their influence by what's called soft power, development, investment, loans, vocational schools, building railroads. It does it does extend power. It means the loans have to be repaid. The technology will be bound to Chinese technology. So it'll be an expansion of power. Whether it will be the style of British, American, French, Dutch imperialism, violence based on white supremacy and Christianity, I don't know. History suggests maybe not. But I don't think we have to accept that as a necessary future. Western imperialism can change its manner of operation. Doesn't have to be force and violence and Christian white supremacy. That can be dropped. We can move towards a multipolar world in which China's existence is not a threat, and U.S. existence have to be there. In fact, I don't have to tell you this because you know it as well as I do, if not better, but we're living at a moment in history where we have to decide very quickly, generation or so, whether we're going to exterminate the human species or whether we're going to survive. And that the answer to that is going to be given in large part by whether the US can cooperate with China. China and the US either cooperate or we all go down to doom together. It's as simple as that. So there has to be cooperation on heating the environment, on nuclear war, on pandemics, all of these things and much more require international cooperation and solidarity. We don't achieve it, we're finished. We will have shown that the human species has the intelligence to destroy, but not the moral capacity to overcome that ability. That's what we're on the verge, the question we're on the verge of answering. And that means we cannot look forward to an imperial future. We must work towards a future of cooperation. That doesn't mean condoning crimes committed by others or accepting our own crimes, but it does mean working towards increased cooperation, mutual support, and so on. And you can see the self-destructive character of the confrontation constantly. Actually, you can read this morning's New York Times. It's a very good article by a good economic analyst, Benjamin Appelbaum, discussing the effects of Trump's tariffs on China. The effect of Trump's tariffs on China to punish China and to mobilize his base, because part of the way of mobilizing them was fear of the yellow peril. What he did was impose tariffs. He called himself Tariff Man, remember? Well, you look at the effect of the tariffs, they harm Americans. They don't harm Chinese. Higher prices, part of the reason for the supply chain blockage, which is causing havoc around the world, is that American companies were not permitted to buy Chinese chassis for trucks. So now they lack trucks. So there's blocks at the ports. So inflation is going up. So you can't get goods at all as a way to mobilize Trump's base in fear of the yellow peril. Well, that's a way to destroy yourself. In fact, China's its greatest ally, its hope for China to gain global dominance is for the United States to commit suicide by measures that are destroying itself. And they're carrying out these measures under the leadership of the Republican Party, which is destroying the United States. You may have seen that a couple of days ago, a European Commission on Democracy, I've forgotten its name, tried to do a study of advances and declines of democracy throughout the world. And one of the most important example of decline of democracy was the United States under the assault of the Republican Party, which is no longer a political party in any traditional sense. It's been described by centrist analysts correctly as a radical insurgency, which has abandoned parliamentary politics, something new in the history of the Western democracies. You see something like it in Orban's Hungary, but not yet, at least in the Western democracies. Though I must say that Boris Johnson's England was moving in that direction with proroguing Parliament, rejecting the Brexit treaty he had just initiated in the Irish Sea and so on, moving in that direction. But the United States is pretty far along. And Republicans take power next year, as is very likely, it'll go farther in that direction. It's a severe threat to the United States because of US power. It's a severe threat to the world. And it's a gift to China. Yes, China's looking on happily as the United States destroys itself and allows China to expand its soft power and influence. Going back to your question, I think it's basically moot. If there's going to be a Chinese empire or an American empire, we're finished. We have to cooperate or there is no future.
I think that will have to be the last question. Thank you everyone for joining us, and once again, thank you to Noam Chomsky for taking the time to talk to us. Once again, thank you very much.
Sorry, but
I think that will have to be the last question. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us and answer.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Very pleased to be with you. Thank you.